In the last session, we concluded the apocalyptic discourse looking at the second specific prediction of the coming woes. Then we looked at the Great Tribulation and the end in which the Son of Man returns. Then we examined the two short sections that conclude the apocalyptic discourse, the lessons of the fig tree and the need for watchfulness. Then we examined the text on the anointing at Bethany and concluded with the institution narrative of the Last Supper. In this session, we turn our attention to the Passion narrative. We begin by taking a look at the general overview of the Passion narrative in Mark. Then we will focus on the first parts, the Gethsemane scene with the arrest of Jesus and the Jewish trial, including the denial of Peter. Since the publication of the two-volume work on the Passion of Jesus, The Death of the Messiah, by Raymond E. Brown, most interpreters have followed Brown in restricting the Passion narrative to the material from the Gethsemane scene to the burial of Jesus. This material would comprise the second half of the 14th chapter of Mark's Gospel and the entire of the 15th chapter. This is contrary to the liturgical Passion narrative read on Passion Sunday in Cycle B, which includes the whole of the 14th chapter, that is, the anointing at Bethany and the Last Supper narratives we discussed in the last session. Brown divides the Passion narrative into 4 sections, each of which has a subsection. The 4 sections are the Gethsemane scene, also known as the garden scene, the Jewish trial, the Roman trial, and finally the Via Dolorosa, or Way of the Cross, which culminates in the death scene. Since, as we shall see, the disciples forsake Jesus in the Markan narrative, and he is left virtually alone to undergo the Passion, the question is asked, how do we know that what is written in the Scriptures is true? To answer that, we look to the one fact on which there is universal agreement. Jesus of Nazareth died on a cross. Hence, the death scene. And the way through which he, as any other person executed by the Romans, reached the cross was by carrying his crossbeam. In order to get to that execution, there had to be a trial before Roman authorities. But the charges against Jesus were religious, and so there also had to be a trial before the Jewish religious authorities, a Jewish or Sanhedrin trial. And finally, he had to be apprehended to be brought to these trials. This is part of the Gethsemane scene. So given that one undisputed fact, we can logically work out the general structure of the Passion narrative. Now, connected with the Gethsemane scene is the arrival of the arrest party and Judas's betrayal of Jesus with a kiss. As a part of the Jewish or Sanhedrin trial, we hear of Peter's denial. As Jesus is affirming his identity inside the high priest's house, outside, Peter is denying any association with Jesus. Interspersed with the Roman trial is a rather interesting account of the release of one Barabbas, which serves to focus the blame for these events away from the Romans and squarely on the Jewish authorities. Finally, after the narrative of Jesus' death, we find the account of the rather elaborate burial that Jesus is given. The Passion narrative ends with a few women noting the place where Jesus has been laid to return after the Sabbath to complete the burial, anointings, etc. The Gethsemane scene gets its name from the location where it occurs, the Garden of Gethsemane. It is named as such because of the oil press used for crushing olives that was located in the vicinity. An olive grove grew on the western slope of the Mount of Olives near Jerusalem. While in Jerusalem, Jesus is said to have frequented this spot. Mark's narrative begins telling us that after the Last Supper and the singing of the Hallel Psalms, Jesus and his disciples went to the place called Gethsemane, a term which we saw meaning gat, oil, and samane, press. Upon arrival, Jesus says to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." This is not the first time that we see Jesus at prayer in the Gospel of Mark. In chapter 1, after the initial success of his ministry, he took time alone to pray, Mark 1:35. And after the multiplication of loaves in chapter 6, Jesus separated himself from his disciples to take time to pray. Thus, private prayer was not something foreign to Jesus. This is a picture of the Garden of Gethsemane as it exists today. In the back, you will notice the thick trunk trees. It's possible that some of these trees date back to the time of Christ, or relatively near the time of Christ. From the accounts of 4th century pilgrims, we're told that a magnificent church was already on this site. However, it was destroyed in the turmoil in the Holy Land over the centuries. However, the Franciscans oversaw the completion of the current church, known as the Church of All Nations, which surrounds the rock on which tradition tells us that Jesus prayed. In contrast to the Church of the Transfiguration, which was, as we saw, dominated by light, this church, recalling the beginning of the Passion that ultimately led to Jesus' death, is dominated by darkness. Leaving 8 of his disciples, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John a bit forward. These 3 have been earlier in the gospel witnesses to the signs and wonders of Jesus. In chapter 5, they witnessed the raising of the daughter of Jairus, and in chapter 9, they were witnesses to the transfiguration. They've seen Jesus do things no one else has done, and they've witnessed the glory of his divinity. Now they're called to witness the opposite, Jesus' distress and weakness. Mark tells us that Jesus began to be greatly distressed and troubled. The verb for greatly distressed, ekthambesthai, has a note of astonishment about it. It was as though this distress almost surprises Jesus. To this astonishing distress, the note of being troubled is added. Joining the two together, Jesus' distress is so great that he wishes death. This wish is expressed in his statement to the 3, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." Then he gives them a double command: remain here and watch. This is reminiscent of the commands given in the apocalyptic discourse in chapter 13. Watch, be awake, be ready, be watchful. This signals that the end is near. But as we shall see, the disciples fail to grasp it. Jesus then advances a little further away from the 3 disciples and falls to the ground and prays. The prayer of Jesus expresses probably the most human sentiments that we find in the Gospel of Mark. The text of the prayer begins, "If it is possible." John Donahue tells us that this does not cast doubt on the power of God. Rather, it is Jesus asking God to change the plan regarding his suffering and death. Jesus is distressed at the face of death, as would any human being be. He is asking that the hour might pass. That is, he might accomplish his mission in another way, not the horrible death that awaits him. He restates his request with the intimate address, Abba, Jesus knows that all is possible with God. Therefore he asks that the cup, a term we have seen with James and John in chapter 10 as referring to the cross and death of Jesus, might be removed. If there is any other way of accomplishing this mission, let that be known now. But Jesus continues expressing his total trust in the Father. Yet not my will, but your will be done. This is reminiscent of the third petition of the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done. With the completion of his prayer, Jesus returns to find the disciples sleeping. They have not heeded his command before he prayed. And so he says to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Are you not strong enough to watch? Peter, James, and John were commanded to remain and watch. They have failed. Upon his unexpected return, Jesus finds them sleeping, and so he exhorts them a second time to watch and pray, that you may not enter into temptation. Again, we have a connection to the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into temptation, or the test. They are to pray, lest they succumb when the test of good versus evil occurs. In conclusion, Jesus correctly assesses the situation, noting that the spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus then leaves them a second time and goes to pray. Upon his return, he finds them once again asleep. Mark tells us that their eyes were very heavy. This is a further illustration of the weakness of the flesh. They're weighed down. All they can do is sleep. They did not know what to answer him. They realize that they have left the Master down. Twice he's asked them to pray, and twice they've succumbed to sleep. And so he returns a third time to pray, only to come back and find them a third time asleep. And so he simply questions, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? They have failed him totally. The next phrase is difficult to translate. It is usually translated as, it is enough, possibly indicating that Jesus has had enough of this. However, joined with the following statement, it could be translated as a further question. Do you think that the end is distant? And Jesus answers, it's not. The hour has come. The final ordeal for Jesus is beginning. And what is that ordeal? The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of men. The arrest party is cited. Jesus will be apprehended. With that, the Gethsemane scene ends. Jesus allows himself to be seen in a most human way. But now the betrayer approaches, and the arrest is imminent. The passion narrative has begun. The disciples, Peter, James, and John, and most likely the other 8, are to get up. Jesus is going to confront his betrayer, who is imminent. In typical Markan style, Judas, who is described as one of the 12, arrives immediately, before Jesus can even finish what he's saying. He's not alone. He's brought with him a full-blown arrest party. They're a crowd armed with swords and clubs. They've been sent from the opposition, from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. At night, with such a number of people, it might be difficult to pinpoint whom this group should arrest. So Judas has arranged a sign, a signal. he will approach one of the group in the garden and kiss him. That one is the one. The kiss has traditionally been a greeting and a sign of respect between a rabbi and his students. Judas has therefore turned this symbol on its head, using it to make sure that the arrest party gets the right person. The rabbi's mark of respect has been twisted into a sign of betrayal. Once Judas has given the sign, they are to arrest Jesus and lead him away securely. The Greek asphalos, which is translated securely, has the sense of efficiently. Once they know who they are to arrest, let it be done with the utmost efficiency, quickly, and without question. Having let the reader know what is to happen, Mark proceeds to narrate the arrest. The betrayer came to Jesus. Note that Judas is not named, he's simply the betrayer. Addresses him as Rabbi, greets him with a kiss. But as we know, that kiss has so much more connected with it. Upon receiving the signal, the arrest party springs into action. They lay hands on Jesus and arrest him. There is an immediate response to the arrest. A bystander, clearly not one of the disciples, draws his sword and strikes, cutting the ear of the high priest's servant, seemingly one of those in command of the arrest party. There are many interpretations of this action. The two most interesting are either the bystander struck the servant with such a blow that he cut off his earlobe, the otarion, a small part of the ear, not the ear itself, which would be represented by the Greek word ous as opposed to otarion. Oh, how helpful that Greek can be. This constituted mutilation and thus, in accordance with Jewish law, disqualified him from his priestly service. Or the bystander administers the punishment of a robber. Loss of an ear was the punishment given to a robber since Persian times. Evans notes that this is ironic, since Jesus is arrested as though he were a robber. A second reaction comes from Jesus himself. He questions the arrest party. Have you come out as against a lestes, a robber, with swords and clubs to seize me? The meaning hinges on the translation of the word lestes. It can be a simple robber or a brigand, rebel, or insurrectionist. They're familiar with his teaching and his teaching methods. Day after day I was with you, he tells them, in the temple area, yet you did not arrest me. Certainly prior to this moment, they did not see him as any kind of a threat. Yet now, at the moment of their action, they see him in quite a different light. Mark and Jesus see this as a fulfillment of Scripture. But Mark does not cite any particular text. The fulfillment formula seems to drop off. Many would see the scripture referred to here as being Zechariah 13:17, cited earlier in the Last Supper narrative. This is the first movement of the Jewish officials to strike at the shepherd. Then all of the 11 disciples and the followers with him left him and fled. The prophecy of Mark 14:27 has been fulfilled. All the talk of dying with him vaporizes when the moment of truth arrives. Only one remains, a young man, Aeneaniskos, who follows him. He's described as wearing a peculiar form of dress, a linen cloth, which is in Greek sindon. It covers a naked body. A sindon is a burial shroud, as we shall see later in the burial texts. So this young man is clothed in a burial shroud following Jesus. The arresting officers, seeing him following, seize him as they seized Jesus. he manages to get out of the Sindone and runs off naked. He seems to be a follower of Jesus, but in actuality at this point he is the exact opposite. Contrary to the disciples who were told to leave all things to follow Jesus, this young man literally leaves all things to avoid following him. The term neoniskos will appear again at 16:5 in the empty tomb narrative. There we shall ask the question, is there any significance to the same word being used in both places? Following the arrest party leads Jesus away to the place where the Sanhedrin has gathered for a special night session. Only Mark has what seemingly is a dual hearing with the Sanhedrin. First, an unofficial interrogation of Jesus by the high priest in the middle of the night, and second, an official session before the whole Sanhedrin, seemingly the next morning. Mark begins the narrative of the arrest with the note that Jesus is led away to the high priest. Then he tells us that it's not just the high priest, but all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes have come to witness this interrogation and possibly take part in it themselves. Now this is quite unusual. They're in the middle of a major celebration, Passover, and all these Jewish officials will leave their families to come together for a hearing? The location seemingly was the house of the high priest, rather than the official meeting place of the Sanhedrin, the chamber of the hewn stone. Mark then lets us know that indeed all did not flee. Peter is following at a distance, perhaps for fear of being seized, and goes right into the high priest's courtyard of his house, sits down with the guards, and warms himself at the fire. Spring evenings in the Holy Land can be quite chilly, so a fire to keep those outside warm is common. Thus, the two key parts of this narrative are set up. This is a map of the city of Jerusalem as it existed in the time of Jesus. You will note that the upper room is located in the southwestern portion of the city, the lower left of the map, known as the upper city. From there, the disciples and Jesus made their way to Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, to the east of the city, more toward the upper right of the map. Here Jesus is arrested and then brought to the palace of the high priest Caiaphas, which is located in the same part of the city as the upper room. It would basically be just a little bit below the upper room section that we see narrated there in the city. Thus, on the night of his arrest, Jesus traverses the entire city of Jerusalem several times. Here we have a picture of the palace of Caiaphas the high priest, as it is depicted in the model of the city of Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. In the forefront, you can see the south and western walls of the city. Today, the Church of St. Peter Gallicantu stands on the site. In the lower church, we can see the ruins of what many think are the palace of Caiaphas. What is most striking in the lower church, however, are a series of frescoes depicting the denial of Peter. The first is Peter vehemently denying Jesus. Non novi illum, it says at the bottom. I do not know the man. This is followed by a fresco of Peter alone weeping bitterly. The interrogation begins with the gathered authorities trying to obtain testimony, which they could use to put Jesus to death. But such testimony was difficult to come by. They found none, Mark tells us. According to the Jewish law, at least two witnesses must agree word for word in their testimony for charges to be made. Mark tells us that many gave false witness against him. They did not pass the test of agreement. Mark is very straightforward on the fact that this hearing or trial was most likely based on a series of trumped-up charges. Then he gives what these false witnesses were alleging. We heard him say, they testify, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days build another, not made with hands. Even at that, there was no agreement on what exactly Jesus said. On the surface, the Sanhedrin interpreted the alleged statement literally regarding the temple building in Jerusalem. Thus interpreted, the statement makes no sense at all. As we see in the Gospel of John, Jesus was more than likely referring to his body, which would be destroyed in the crucifixion and restored on the 3rd day in the resurrection. The high priest, in the midst of all, rises and asks Jesus whether he has anything to say to these charges. Jesus' response is silence. This is an allusion to the 4th servant canticle found in Isaiah 53. He remains silent like a lamb before his shearers. This prompts the high priest to ask again. However, this time he phrases the question in different terms. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? By asking if he was the Messiah, the high priest is shifting the trial from the temple to the messianic expectations of Israel. Is Jesus the one who will fulfill those expectations? The phrase, Son of the Blessed One, confirms that. Jesus' answer is short and to the point. I am. It's important to remember that this answer is simply affirming that he is the Messiah. It in no way is an invocation of the divine name. But then Jesus appends to his affirmation a citation of Psalm 110:1 and Daniel 7:13. From Daniel he says, you will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. By the time of Jesus, the figure of the Son of Man was an eschatological or end-time figure who would come for judgment. From Psalm 110 we discover that this messianic judge is seated at the right hand of power. In essence, Jesus is turning the tables on the high priest and the Sanhedrin. They're not sitting in judgment on him, but the day is coming when he will be the one to judge them. The reaction of the high priest to this is swift. He rises, rends his garments. That's the requirement of the law when a legal body hears blasphemy. The high priest says, what further need have we of witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What precisely was the blasphemy? The Mishnah, a compilation of Jewish law, says that he who blasphemes is liable only when he will have fully pronounced the divine name. That legal qualification is not met in the dialogue that precedes. Jesus does not pronounce the divine name. Hence, there is no technical blasphemy here, although some interpreters hold that there is enough here to constitute blasphemy. So the high priest then questions the assembly. What do you think? They condemned him as deserving to die, which is the prescribed punishment for blasphemy. Then some from the assembled leaders take it upon themselves to mock him. The mockery takes the form of spitting and harassing him as a prophet. They blindfold him, they strike him, and then want to tell him who it was that was striking him. The purpose is to humiliate and shame Jesus. It's clear that this assembly does not in any way see Jesus as being who he has claimed to be. Finally, the guards who are securing the chamber enter into the mockery and humiliation. The mention of the guards makes a connection with the next section, as they are the ones with whom Peter was warming himself. The scene now switches to the outside, to where Peter has been warming himself. He's approached by several of the maidservants of the high priest who question his affiliation with this Jesus, who was inside before the high priest. This is a close-up of what the high priest's palace may have looked like in first century Jerusalem. Note the entrances that lead out to the street. It will be just inside these entrances that Peter would have been warming himself in a courtyard with the servants of the high priest. The focus turns now to Peter in the courtyard below. The action is initiated by one of the maidservants of the high priest, who, seeing Peter warming himself, looks at him intently and notes, "You too were with the Nazarene Jesus." Mark carefully builds on the statement of the maidservant and Peter's response, which is a quick denial. "I neither know nor understand what you are talking about." So Peter, who would die for Jesus, when confronted with the reality that he's a disciple, does exactly what Jesus predicted. He denies. Peter then goes to the outer court, and Mark quietly notes that at that moment the cock crowed. Peter has denied his master once. Peter's answer has not satisfied the maidservant. Rather, she now goes to the others warming themselves. "This man was one of them," she says, with conviction. Peter, on the other hand, again denies it. He is now denied twice. The word is spreading that Peter is one of them. And so, a little later, another of those standing around in the courtyard addresses Peter a third time. "Surely you are one of them. You too are a Galilean." How is Peter pegged as a Galilean? Well, the moment he opened his mouth, his accent betrayed him. Even in a country as small as Israel, the various dialects could have developed distinctive accents. Matthew, in his account, makes this explicit. Peter's response this third time is more adamant than the previous. He now curses and swears, "I do not know this man about whom you are talking." To reinforce his separation from Jesus, he also keeps his distance in his cursing and swearing, using the term "this man" rather than the name Jesus. He has now denied Jesus 3 times. And in typical Markan style, he employs the adverb immediately. The cock crows a second time. This leads Peter to remember the words of Jesus spoken at the Last Supper. "Before the cock crows twice, you shall deny me 3 times. Indeed, this is what Peter has done. This memory heightens the drama and the poignancy of the scene. Only Luke has a more jarring detail. Jesus looks out on the courtyard to see Peter in his final denial, and Peter's eyes catch Jesus' eyes. The result of Jesus' correctness comes crashing down on Peter. He breaks down weeping. With Peter's denial, the flight of the apostles is complete. Jesus now faces the cross totally alone. We leave you with this picture of Peter alone, despondent and weeping, as he's depicted on the wall of the sanctuary of St. Peter in Gallicantu. And a question: how often have our actions denied our relationship to Christ? How often have we felt as Peter?